Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's Kaffeepause. At each Kaffeepause, we check in with a journalist based in Germany to talk about the news stories behind the headlines. And today I am delighted to speak with Alfred Schmit. He's a radio correspondent in ARD's Capital Studio in Berlin. Alfred, herzlich willkommen.
Hello, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
So I am really looking forward to our conversation because, as is almost always the case when we do our Kaffeepause, there is lots of news to unpack, and there are some really interesting stories to talk about today. But before we dive in, can you just talk to us a little bit about the political mood, right? The Stimmung in Berlin.
Yeah, I think this week is actually characterized by the topics of the migration. Actually, that's going to take place. There's a conversation between the Bund and the Länder, the federal state of Germany, and that's been really on people's minds because since the situation in Ukraine 14 months ago has changed rapidly. There we've seen about 1 million people from there as refugees in our countries, plus another 300,000 applying for political asylum. So that's a situation that some people have already compared, although I think that's not comparable at all, to the 2015-16 situation. And this week on Wednesday, there's going to be high-level talks here in Berlin between the Chancellery and the federal states on who actually will take care of those people, who will house them, who will do their Medicaid, Medicare, and how their children will go to school or other possibilities there, and who will pay for it, of course, too, because that has changed. In 2016, they introduced a sort of a rule that the Bund gives a certain sum per capita to the Länder, to the federal states. And this is much debated because the federal states say, okay, we don't have enough money. Berlin, please give us more. And the federal government here is actually not in favor of that theory. Otherwise, we're going to see reverberations of the party convention of the CSU in Bavaria, the local CSU party there, who have already introduced Markus Söder again as their prime candidate for the upcoming elections, because there's going to be 3 elections in Germany on the state level. That's Bremen in the middle of May, and in the fall there's going to be Bavaria and the state of Hesse, who will see federal elections on this level. So everyone's pretty anxious about those, especially the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats, because they have been developing in a way that they cannot be satisfied with, and the governing Social Democrats as well. So you could say, I think it was Churchill who somebody said that in the middle of the legislative period, it is best for any government to be down in the slums in the Umfragen, in the surveys, in the polls, in the surveys and the polls. So people have been saying to the pollsters, we're not really satisfied with the current government, and we're concerned with migration. We're concerned with, and that's another topic that's been on people's minds recently, with the energy development. Energy prices have gone up. Particularly in Germany, and the inflation overall, the cost of living, that's on people's minds now at the beginning of May 2023.
Well, so those are lots of topics, and I'd like to maybe come back to each of them, maybe even in that order, and just unpack them a little bit more. It was interesting over the weekend, and certainly today, the media is full of reports about the refugee summit that you talked to. It will take place on Wednesday in the Chancellery. And as you said, it's a great opportunity for the federal government to get together with state representatives and talk a little bit more about what the needs are of state and local governments when it comes to just this tremendous influx of refugees. There have been a couple of state governments, state representatives like Hendrik Wüst, the minister-president in North Rhine-Westphalia, who has said that the distribution of financing should be 50-50 between the Bund, the federal level, and the state level. But the federal government does not seem to be willing to step up that level of support. And it argues that the responsibility rests with the states. Can you talk a little bit about that specific debate over the financing and who's responsible for what, and where some of the the concerns are at the state and local level?
Yes, definitely. It was the rule that 670 euro per person who has come to us to Germany as refugee was to be given from the federal state, from the Bund level to the Länder, to the 16 federal states. So Berlin gave money, but that's a stretch from 2016 to 21. They got rid of that rule in 21, and the Bund, the Berlin government, doesn't really want to change that. Now, the Green Party has said over the weekend they could very well imagine this being stepped up, please Bund give more money to the communal level because they are having problems with housing, with school, with kita, which is like for the smaller children of refugees, and for the medical care as well. So that's a problem. It's about 5 billion euro estimated that this money that the Bund gives to the Länder is now, because since they've changed that, anyone, and that's a new development, anyone who comes to us from the Ukraine gets the new Bürgergeld, which covers the so-called existence minimum. So that's like the minimum you need to actually, literally get by in this country. So that's already 90% of the cost that's covered by the Bund. So with these 5 billion euro in pocket, the Länder shouldn't really be in a position to be alarmed, one could say, 36 hours before this top-level meeting will take place. And the distribution of money between the Bund and the Länders and the distribution of money overall is, of course, an issue to be discussed, but political analysts have already warned the Länder to make this the main point of Wednesday's conversation, because there are other chances and opportunities to discuss that, the general distribution of money between the levels of state. And this is not the time and place to do it, because it should be pivotal that one talks about the situation with the refugees. So that is also going to be discussed, as well as how to speed up the process of giving political asylum to a person in this country where we're living, because the Länder are having to face digitizing their administration, speeding it up, and also give them better equipment technically and with personnel, because that's the problem that the very process of getting political asylum in this country can be a lengthy one. And the Bund has already told the Länders to actually try and speed that up. So it's not just about money, it's about housing, it's about organizing. And when we talk about housing, really literally talking about space, living space for people, because in many cases, there have been sports convenience centers, there have been certain halls, certain forsaken buildings who've been reactivated, and that's not an easy thing to do, and you can't do that in the matter of days. So it's not just about money, it's also about organizing and really literally space to live in.
So Alfred, I have two sort of direct follow-up questions to that. One is, of course, the housing and the schooling questions are incredibly important, right? Part of that is because so many children have come from the Ukraine and they need to be in daycare in the kitas and in schools. And that's something that's largely paid for by the state. Can you talk a little bit about sort of whether there's any willingness on the part of the federal government to cover some of these expenses that are generally state expenses?
Well, as far as I'm informed as of now, the Bund will go into those talks with a certain sorry no, because they have to take care of this themselves, the communal level and the federal state level. And the Bund has said, okay, we're covering 5 billion euro of the cost. That is 90% of the living expenses of the 1 million people who've come in here from Ukraine. And then there's talk about the other people. As I've said, it's about 300,000 just at present who are seeking political asylum in this country. So it's going to be a possibility that at the end of Wednesday, we're going to have more questions on those issues than ready answers. And sometimes for us journalists, it's also a bit of a frustrating experience, because we've been preparing those events with at least 72 hours preparation in advance, also preparing actually the public and our listeners and viewers and audience in general to also be on the same page and to be competent to be talking about these things, because it is our money, of course, in general, because it's taxpayers' money. So that's our duty to inform people how we're standing on that one. And as I've said, it is a possibility that at the end of Wednesday, we're going to have more questions than answers on those.
I mean, it certainly sounds as if Wednesday is important, but will not necessarily be decisive. And so coming out of Wednesday, there will be even more details that need to be hammered out. I'd like to come back to something, though, that you sort of alluded to a little bit earlier, which I think is an interesting question around this. Part of the concern is the financing, right? The fact that you have people like the minister president in North Rhine-Westphalia and others calling for more money from the federal government. But the other part of it is structural, as you've also talked about, that it's just the capacity building. How does one sort of integrate and take care of all these people? Do you think is that where we'll see a debate? Is this a financial question? Is it a money question? Or is it a structural question? What's more important right now?
I think we're going to see both. And when it comes to money, I see a possibility looming of there being new quarrel between the three coalition parties. It's actually the first time we've had that on the federal level. It's the Social Democrats, who are actually also, in the Chancellery. The Chancellor Olaf Scholz is SPD, Social Democrats. And then comes the Green Party, and the third is the Liberal Democrats. And they, among each other, have been at odds on many levels, like, let's say, nuclear power plants and them running longer than originally planned. Actually, also on the minimum money, existential safe money for children in this country. Mm-hmm. That's about 10 to 12 billion euro, again, that the Minister for Families and Young People would like the finance minister to set aside for her scheme, and he seems unwilling to do that because he again would say it's not just about money, it's also about organizing. And here at this political field and those issues on migration and refugees, we're facing the same problem. We are living in a country that has set aside extra 100 billion euro for the Bundeswehr, and that's been happening 14 months ago. That's basically new debt. That's what we're talking about, credits. I know that the federal government, has coined the word Sondervermögen for this, which makes it sound like a special fortune. Now, that's misleading in my view, because it is debt, definitely, and that's a burden on further generations, no doubt. Plus another 200 billion, and that's twice the money we're talking about here, to give us all, and companies and private households, help for coping with energy prices been going up in the last 14 months since Russia attacked Ukraine. So that's another thing that the budget just has to cope with. And on those grounds, that's also important to know on what background those top level discussions will take place. People are starting to count the pennies now. On the other hand, people have said, well, we're spending so much. Where's the money for education? Where's the money for schools and essential things and, other projects? And why should we be, thrifty with trouble that refugees have gone through? Those million people who've come to us from Ukraine are basically fleeing from the bombs, like from Putin's bombs, they would say. I'd say rightfully so. So that is actually very politically charged in many ways. And as I've said, the Green Party has formulated the opportunity and their will to give more money to the lenders to cope with those costs for refugees. And that's a new possible quarrel within the coalition government of those three parties here in Berlin.
So I think that's a really interesting point. I did notice, of course, that there seems to be unity between the Social Democrats and the Free Democrats. The Greens seem to be splitting away. Most notably, Ricarda Lang, the co-chair of the Greens, came out quite actively behind the states and the regions and indicating that the federal government should pay more. And this could, as you indicate, lead to a rift within the traffic light coalition. I don't know whether there's any more to add to the current sort of split over the migration issue right now, or if we should go on and talk a little bit about sort of what else has been going on in the Green Party, because last week it seemed as if they were dominating the press as well. And Robert Habeck, who was very popular in many, many polls, seems to be losing his popularity. But the Greens as well seem to be losing some popularity. And this is particularly important given the upcoming state elections that you were talking about. So, I mean, if you'd like to add to the Green debate related to migration, I'm happy to hear any thoughts you might have, but I'd also be happy to sort of put where the Greens are in a broader context.
Yes, it's been quite a week for the Green Party because last week some polls were published where the Greens are actually on one level with the AfD now, the Alternative für Deutschland. That's a far-right party whose arrival in German parliaments on the state level and on the federal level has shaken up everything in the last 10 years. It's just had we've been existing for 10 years celebration now. On the weekend, by the way, was the celebration of the Green Party, 30 years of the Green, 3-0, founded in Karlsruhe in the southwest of Germany. And in Leipzig, they celebrated 30 years of the Greens. And as you can imagine, the Greens are, a party of peace movement, anti-nuclear power movement. That's their root, and have, of course, developed into both as voters are concerned and as parliamentarians are concerned, mostly a party who has moved from, let's say, from the left of the political center in towards the middle, into the middle of the political landscape. And they are now much more attractive to larger quantities of the voters overall. So we were talking about 25, 26% some months before the last federal election in September 21. And then they've seen a decline between April and September 21 when the Bundestagswahl, the election on the federal level, took place here in Germany. The Greens have seen a downfall because their main candidate, Annalena Baerbock, she didn't do so well in the polls anymore because of some glitches, I might say, in her campaign. One of them was down to the fact that she had copied off some parts of the book that she published. She'd been unclear when it came to her CV at some point, so that didn't go down well with the people. So as a result of that, the polls drop. Now, this latest drop in the polls sees them down to 16% on one level with the AfD. And I would say possibly two main reasons for that. One is the energy politics of Robert Habeck as Minister for Climate Change and Economics. That's in one ministry, has been for the last year and a half. And I think he made a communicative mistake when he was talking about how we all need to contribute to fighting man-made climate change by way of using the way we heat our places, our apartments, our houses. Heizungsstreit, that was the thing. He could have said, ladies and gentlemen, we need to speed this up. We, the state, are actually collecting money now to give you all the opportunity to have subsidized renovation of your heating at home. That would have been a good way to communicate it. As opposed to that, he came across like saying, listen, folks, from next January, there will be no new gas and oil heatings anymore because those are fossil fuels and those are bad for you. Like that's, I'm exaggerating now, but that's the way the message came across. So as a result, people ordered new boilers, burning gas, like at the last minute, because they figured, oh, from January, that's going to be forbidden.
Right.
And I say forbidden explicitly because that is an image that the Green Party is fighting with, that like Verbotspartei, the party that likes to forbid things. So that didn't go down well in the polls. Plus, the other problem was that Robert Habeck had one of his co-workers, one of his Staatssekretäre. It was like in other countries, you might say vice ministers. So he's a high-ranking figure in his ministry by the name of Patrick Greichen. And he laid himself open to claims that he actually possibly did an act of nepotism. So because there was this guy who was his Trauzeuge, at his wedding by his side, like his best man at his wedding, surprisingly got a position as a potential new head of DENA, which is the Deutsche Energieagentur. So that's a state agency with a managerial position, including a managerial salary, as you can imagine. And of course, that's an impossible impression that you're giving some high-ranking job to a friend. And that's something everybody in the Green Party has identified as having been a mistake. They got rid of that decision. There's a new process now of electing a new person to chair this energy agency, and of course the damage to the image of both Habeck and Greichen themselves is quite remarkable. So those two factors, I think, have to be taken into account when you talk about the Green Party and why are they down in the polls now. So it's not been a good week for the Greens recently.
I mean, that's fascinating to hear about that, and to know that these kinds of personnel decisions can also have this negative impact. I mean, I think many of our viewers and our listeners are aware of sort of the ups and downs of the Green Party in the past, and particularly the transformation of the Green Party in recent years and since the beginning of the year, and concerns about energy and energy prices. But this new chapter around the nepotism and Patrick Griechen is a new story. And it's interesting to hear that Robert Habeck might personally be tremendously affected by that, but also that the party overall, that it could have a negative impact on the party overall. So this is definitely something worth following in terms of the standing of the Greens. And that then leads to maybe a conversation about some of the other parties and where they stand at the moment as well. You mentioned in your introduction that over the weekend, the Bavarian CSU held their party conference in Nuremberg, and it was not a surprise, but there is strong support for Markus Söder, the minister president of Bavaria, to be the next minister president. I guess I have two questions for you. One is, what were your key takeaways from the party conference in terms of how the CSU is positioning itself? But the other is, Markus Söder, his name was circulating as a possible chancellor candidate in the last election, and he said very clearly that he's committed to Bavaria and not necessarily to working on a national level. But given his popularity, what do you think the likelihood is that we'll be hearing a lot more from him after the election this fall?
Well, he reiterated that he wouldn't be standing for chancellor and that his main task lies in Bavaria. Some, although, might say that the last Saturday has actually seen two coronations, one in London, Charles III, and one in Nuremberg, Markus Söder, as the next crown prince for the CSU, for the Christian Social Union. I would say whenever Markus Söder says that he will not be a candidate for chancellor, sorry, there's a hospital right next to where I'm sitting in the Capitol studio in the center of Berlin. Whenever Markus Söder would say that he's actually not interested in being a candidate for the chancellery, you can be certain that it is a certain perhaps. Like, whenever he says no, it's a perhaps, and whenever he says perhaps, it's a yes. And we've seen that in 2021 when he was actually battling with Armin Laschet, who then made the candidate for the CDU, for the Conservative Party in Germany, and he lost to Olaf Scholz, as we know now. Some were even quite reproachful back then of Armin Laschet, like, how could you let the legacy of Angela Merkel go? 16 years of successful chancellorship, and that went down the drain. Thank you very much. So he's not been having a good stand recently. In contrast to Markus Söder, he's undisputed, he's unchallenged, he's really ahead of his game, I would say, and that gives him wind under the wings, no doubt, certainly. So the key takeaway messages would be, I say, Markus Söder is still number one. He's practically incorporating whatever the CSU stands for, being an old white man after all, but hugging trees at the same time. And that's another takeaway message. They say, we take care of green issues, no doubt, and we are still the ones for the people who rather eat hot dogs than caviar. And they would say that's the joke, say Leberkäse-Etage in contrast to champagne-Etage. So it's like, we're there for the people on the level of Wurstbrot, like for the people who have a sandwich rather than have caviar with champagne. So that's their message again, and they reiterated that over the weekend. The trouble is that they will have to fight against the new law that the Traffic Light Coalition has put in place just a couple of weeks ago when it comes to election laws, and that's going to change matters for the CSU both and for the Linke, for the left party in this country, because so far there was a rule that if you had a certain number of directly voted for MPs, that would give you a certain amount of seats in the Bundestag, in the federal parliament. And they might get rid of that because if you're under 5%, you're not in. And if you only have 3 direct mandates, so far you were certainly in, with the same amount of votes that, according to your result would give you seats, like 4.8% for the left party was 39 seats, as opposed to just 2 seats. That's a huge difference. And this might happen to the CSU, they argue, possibly too, although some legal experts say, no, that's not true. The CSU is still going to be in there because they're probably, again, going to get possibly all the 46 direct mandates in the state of Bavaria, which, with one exception, they've been gathering, on a regular basis. Because on the state level, counted for all of Germany, the CSU, because it's a regional party in Bavaria where they're very strong, but, compared to the rest of the country, they might end up below 5%, which might effectively kick them out of the Bundestag altogether. They might not be in the federal parliament. And that's something they're actually legally countering in Karlsruhe. And when you say Karlsruhe in Germany, you mostly mean Bundesverfassungsgericht, which is the Supreme Court. That's the constitutional court in this country.
So is there any discussion within the CSU about becoming a national party? I mean, this is something that's been addressed sort of on and off in recent years of whether the CSU needs to expand beyond Bavaria. Is that a realistic consideration?
I think it'd be more realistic for them to join forces with the CDU, with called Listengemeinschaft. And that's basically, well, put in layman's terms, and I am one in that when it comes to that, I understand that much. They would be standing collectively with the CDU. See, that's the thing. You've got 15 federal states with the CDU. Social Democrats are standing for election, and one, that is Bavaria with the CSU. But when it comes to the federal level, they're always in the same fraction of parliament, Bundestag. So they might say, okay, our candidates are in union, literally, with the CDU, and that might prevent, the risk to them, from their point of view, it is a risk of them not going to parliament at all.
Because certainly within the party faction in the Bundestag, they are closely aligned. And so it would seem as if they could strengthen that alignment with the CDU.
True, they could. And some people in this country would argue that over decades, we've seen this preponderance of the CDU when it came to certain states, because they've traditionally been so strong in Bavaria and also in Baden-Württemberg, which on the federal level is still true. We have a state Premier Minister President of the Green Party for more than 10 years now there, Dietrich Kretschmann. But on the federal level, Baden-Württemberg, as well as Bavaria, is still much union homeland. It's the old rule: the further south you go in Germany, the more conservative politics gets.
Yeah.
And also the economic powerhouses are mostly there, and in North Rhine-Westphalia along the Rhine traditionally. So again, this might put them into a less better off position. Getting rid of let's say, circumstances they've gotten used to. Like, we are all Bavaria. That's like certain country, like a conservative heartland. That's a safe bet. Might not be such a safe bet next time when there's the next election coming up, and that's scheduled for September 25.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a ways away to think about the fall of 2025. A lot can happen between now and then, and undoubtedly lots of things that we can watch. It seems, for example, very early to me to be thinking about Kanzlerkandidaten, but it's nice to speculate a little bit. And it's certainly interesting to think about Markus Söder as possibly being in the mix when the time comes for the Christian Democrats and that conservative party to choose a chancellor candidate. But let's talk a little bit about how the other parties are doing. I mean, you talked about the Linke possibly being affected by this change in the Bundestag law. We haven't really talked about how the other traffic light parties are being regarded at the moment either, though. Obviously, the Social Democrats and the Free Democrats. What are their prospects like with a view to the 3 state elections that are coming up on the horizon?
Well, the Liberal Democrats are much better off now than they were a couple of weeks ago, because they've just had their party convention, nationwide party convention at the end of April, which always gives them a boost. Then they've also been able to profit from certain agreements that were made within the traffic light coalition, which are actually judged to be quite negative when it comes to climate change and environmental policies, because after those agreements were reached 3-4 weeks ago, all the NGOs that take care of the environment actually protested against it, and the Greens have been going down since then, in correspondence with the Freie Demokraten, the Free Democrats, going slightly up. Now, they are around 7% only right now, mind you. So that's less than half of what the Greens have. And the FDP, the Free Democrats, are still sitting behind me in the Bundestag with 11.5% of the voters. That's a huge difference. But they were down to 5%, and that's the death zone. You can never be too sure if you make it into parliament at all on those grounds. Having that said, that you need to add that the difference between the polls and the actual results in German elections is always different for the Free Democrats. They're always doing worse in the polls than they will do in the end when it comes down to it. And with the Greens, it's exactly the opposite way around. They're always doing better in the polls compared to their actual results. Part of that can be attributed to the fact that nobody says, well, many people would say to the pollsters, oh yeah, I vote Green because,
Right.
because they're such nice, gentle people, and many of them are students, just to please them. Might be a joke, but it might be some truth to it. And with the Liberal Democrats, with the Free Democrats, it's the other way around, because some might give them an image of they're so pro-business, the cufflink wearing people. Are you really going to vote for them? Possibly not. So you wouldn't actually admit that to the pollsters. Although in this country, polls are much more reliable compared, let's say, to the United Kingdom, where it is, I'm told, I'm an ex-London correspondent, it is cult thing to lie to the pollsters. People would say whatever to them. It's different in this country.
But let me jump in there and stick with the Free Democrats for just a moment, because they have been doing very poorly in each of the last elections, both at the federal level and the state election, 5 of them in total, right? They've seen their numbers going down. They must be a little nervous about the upcoming state elections and feel like this is coming to a sort of make or break moment. So I'd be interested in hearing, your sense of the outlook for them, but also, how is the support for the leader of the party, Christian Lindner, the current finance minister?
That's actually strong. He has been re-elected with 88% of the votes when it was the party convention at the 21st of April, just a couple of weeks ago. And he too, much like Markus Söder, is unrivaled, undisputed. There's nobody challenging him. So he's pretty firm in his seat. That's a clear thing. But, as you've said, the 5 elections on state level in the last 12 months have been quite ruinous for the Free Democrats. We've seen Saarbrücken, Kiel, Düsseldorf, Hanover, and Berlin go down the drains. They were kicked out of parliament twice. They didn't re-enter parliament. They didn't enter parliament, or they were even kicked out of 2 federal state governments. That's in North Rhine-Westphalia, Düsseldorf, and up in Schleswig-Holstein in Kiel. So that you really can't call that a success, besides also for the Secretary General of the party, who's organizing the campaigns for the voters, Bijan Djilsaray. He is the Secretary General of the Free Democrats. It's not really a success story for him. He's been in office for a year and a half, and those 5 elections in a row haven't been going well. The next one is coming up May 14th. That's in Bremen. That's a small one, though, although that's also some indication of how people gauge the value of the Free Democrats. But that's also looking poorly for the Greens. They're down to 13% in Bremen, which used to be Green heartland as well, and they're actually in the government on the state level there. So you can't be too sure how it's going to turn out for them. And that's true of the Social Democrats as well. So you could say the traffic light coalition on the Berlin, like on the federal level, is poor right now. As I've said, in the middle of the legislative period, it is supposed to be poor, because by then they will have had to commit all the atrocities that nobody said anything about in their campaign programs. Plus, we've seen 14 months of really exceptional executive power, and just, it's the hour of the executive, the crisis, the very crisis. And we've seen a crisis on many levels. Now we have this defense issues popping up. We need to re-establish the Bundeswehr as an army that can actually defend the country, which it is not at the moment. We've seen a personnel change at the beginning of the year, the farewell, the demission of Christine Lambrecht as Minister of Defense, and Boris Pistorius has been in office since January. He's, by the way, the most popular politician in Germany right now when it comes to polls. He takes that with a pinch of salt. He takes that with a smile and a sense of humor, saying, okay, that's all very well, but this might change in a minute or two. Maybe a realistic gauging of the situation there.
And so let's talk a little bit about the main opposition party, the Christian Democrats. What's their standing? And in your opinion, has the relatively new leader of the party, Friedrich Merz, sort of moved the party in the direction that it needed to go in order to attract more voters?
He's gathering the points that the government is offering him to take, like last week when the Greens were down in the polls because of this personnel trouble and because of the whole energy legislation with the heating and everything. He just pointed out that within the traffic light coalition, there's various different standpoints as to the cost of this. Like the Free Democrats would say the whole energy change when it comes to heating will cost the state 600 billion over so many years. But Habeck's ministry, the Green economics minister Habeck would say, no, it's just 150 billion. So the opposition Christian Democrats are very quick in pointing out glitches in the traffic light coalition's programs. And they would also, of course, accuse the Greens of nepotism, and they would also accuse the Free Democrats of lingering and not being certain. And Finance Minister Lindner of the Free Democrats accuse him on every corner of running up to debt as, in a way nobody could ever have imagined. And also pointing out that his crisis arguments for those heavy debts are actually also running out. Mr. Finance Minister, would you please return to solid management of the state finances? So they've been gathering points on account of the government losing them, actually. When it comes to a very own profile, it's very much down to the persona of Friedrich Merz, as you pointed out, because ever since he has replaced Armin Laschet, and that's only been in office for a year and a half now, people have really, he's been gathering sympathy points till then. But then he doesn't have to do much except for, basically waiting for the government to make their next mistake. And in this exceptional situation we've been in for the last 14 months, there have been many. Just one example, last summer, the Traffic Light Coalition government announced that there would be certain energy price helps for the country, for the gas and everything. And within a couple of weeks, they had to cancel all that and set up a whole new scheme. That didn't go down well with the voters and with the pollsters as well. So I would say the Christian Democrats have been doing okay when it comes to pointing out the mistakes of the government, but not really creating own alternatives. They're not really, from what I gather, viewed as a party of the future, but rather, as an alternative whenever the current government should not make it. But that's still a long way away. That's another 2.5 years.
Yeah, I was going to say, in a sense, they can sort of auf den Zahnfleisch stochern, right? They can pick at the traffic light coalition without offering any solutions at the moment. But as the next federal election gets closer, they'll have to offer some alternatives. And so it will be very interesting to see how they position themselves then. Alfred, you of course cover economic topics, finance, consumer issues. And earlier in our conversation, you did mention that the public is concerned about energy prices and inflation. And as we start to come to a close, I'd be interested in knowing sort of what some of the other topics are that are front of mind for people in Germany right now, what some of the concerns are that people might have.
Well, we've just seen the last Germany trend last week, and not surprisingly, it's the labor market. It's the personal concern of the economic well-being of every household. How is my job going to develop? How is that going to play out? Am I going to be able to pay my energy bills? And to some, even my food bill, because inflation, as we all know, it bites those who have the least. And if you're on a fixed budget every month, the food bill is something essential to you. And changes, major changes we've seen there within the last 14 months are on people's minds. So that's definitely an issue. Supermarket prices, for food have gone up incredibly. And also people are starting to cut back on where they can afford to. And the first things to go are, in many cases, luxury stuff, like going to a restaurant, like going to a concert, like going on a holiday that may be a little more expensive than what we've had, maybe just stay at home, or travel within Europe or even within Germany, or not at all. So those are the issues that are on people's minds. And then, of course, the climate change to many people still, because in Germany to this very day, and possibly outside my office window again today, people are literally gluing themselves to the ground and disturbing traffic. That was an issue here in Berlin the week before last week, when the last generation climate activists were basically gluing themselves to the floor to raise again awareness for their issues. And over the last weekend, they were here in central Berlin again, pointing out those policies. And that's a much debated issue, because many people in this country now have the feeling that they are going too far. They're also obstructing essential traffic on the road here and there. And that's actually something which might backfire. Many people have the feeling. So those are some of the topics or concerns that are in people's minds currently, in my view.
Well, let me just ask one quick follow-up about the last generation, because certainly in what I've been able to pick up, it has been controversial. On the one hand, obviously, many citizens in Germany are concerned about climate change and don't feel that the government is doing enough. The government came in wanting to take on climate change. Obviously, it has had to deal with a war in Ukraine instead, and there have been elements of addressing climate change concerns that have been involved in Germany's evolving energy policy. But it seems as if the Letzte Generation movement is controversial, because on the one hand, it's drawing attention to the need to do more on climate change, but it is also proving to be very disruptive to a lot of people when roads are blocked and people can't get to where they need to go. How is the last generation sort of playing out, and how is it perceived in Germany?
I think people share their concern. I think people would say, folks, you're trying to raise awareness. Wait a minute, we are very much aware of what you're trying to tell us. And I have a feeling that the means with which they're trying to do that are more debated than the very goals they stand for. There's fewer people in this country who would actually, deny that there's such a thing as man-made climate change. And there's very few people who would deny that it is essential to do something against that very quickly and possibly faster than is convenient to all of us, when it comes down to using traffic, to burning stuff, to flying anywhere, everywhere. And people would always say, oh yeah, it's essential to do something about it. But I don't know whether I would start with me and myself and my consumer situation when it comes to that. So there's definitely a gap between what people perceive needs to be done and what they're willing to do themselves in their own environment and in their own household, basically. So I think the controversy which might continue around those climate activists is that many people don't subscribe anymore to the means with which they're demonstrating and protesting, but would still say, okay, you're fighting for a good cause, although albeit with possibly not such good means. That's I think I would try and sum up like that.
Well, Alfred, herzlichen Dank. Thank you so much for this wide-ranging conversation. I feel like we covered a number of issues, and you've certainly pointed out a number of topics for us to keep our eye on in the future. And so I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to join us for this Kaffeepause. And I hope we can have you again as a speaker at one of our future Kaffeepause discussions.
Absolutely. Sehr gerne. Es war mir ein Vergnügen. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. And to our viewers and to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in today. We hope to welcome you back for the next Kaffeepause as well.